Many hours of public impeachment hearings left little dispute about the facts.
What remains are disputes over what the facts mean and also what to do. Witnesses rarely differed on the big picture here. President Trump asked for investigations of Democrats in Ukraine. His July 25th phone call asking for them was part of an effort involving numerous calls and officials. He also withheld meetings and military aid until those acts were revealed. The country heard from current and former administration officials, including these four.
My worst fear of how our Ukraine policy could play out was playing out.
He was being involved in a domestic political errand, and we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged.
Of course, the president is pressing for a Biden investigation before he'll do these things the Ukrainians want. There was nodding agreement.
Again, everyone was in the loop.
The voices there of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, an active duty military officer, Fiona Hill, a Russia expert who had served in the Trump White House, also David Holmes, a mid-career U.S. diplomat, and Gordon Sondland, an ambassador who gave $1 million to the Trump inauguration.
NPR reporter Tim Mak covers national security and politics, and he's here in our studios. Tim, good morning.
Good morning.
What was it like watching the witnesses on what may have been the final day, particularly the Russia expert Fiona Hill?
Well, she was the sort of person who exuded competence. She said she had been frustrated with Sondland for not working with her on Ukraine issues. That was part of her portfolio, but she later realized that they were working on different lanes. She said Sondland was working on a domestic political errand. You heard that clip earlier. And that he was asking for politically motivated investigations while she was working on national security, and that's why they diverged.
So a devastating phrase there. And beside her, as she testified, was David Holmes, this guy who was working in the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine.
Right. It's become perhaps the second most famous call of this whole saga. He overheard Sondland talking to the president by phone on July 26th and specifically heard the president asking about the investigation he wanted. We didn't hear anything in testimony yesterday that challenges that fact.
And we should note that was, as you said, one of two calls where the president is known to have talked about investigations, the other one asking for them from Ukraine's president, and there's a White House record of that. So what do lawmakers do now?
So Democrats need to decide whether they are done calling witnesses. Take a listen to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
We haven't made any decision, and as I said to the president, if you have any information that is exculpatory, please bring it forward, because it seems that the facts are uncontested as to what happened. Now, if you have reason to convince people that something was different under oath, please let us know.
It's not hard to imagine that there are other folks that Democrats would ideally like to hear from, like acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney or Rudy Giuliani, for example.
Where are Republicans on this?
Well, they've said that there was no conduct because the money was eventually released. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy subscribes to that line of thinking.
I don't know how many more people they want to try to bring forward, but every time they do, it goes right back to the case that the president did not make conditions, the president released the money, and Ukraine did nothing for the money to be released.
It's worth noting, however, that the money was released only after a whistleblower complaint began circulating and the House announced its intent to investigate.
So if this is the last hearing, we're not absolutely sure. Where does the process go from here?
Well, if they're finished with hearing from witnesses, they will need to write a report and provide it to the House Judiciary Committee to consider potential articles of impeachment against the president. It certainly sounds like the House Intelligence Committee was making closing arguments yesterday as they wrapped up.
Including one from Adam Schiff, the committee chairman, who said the country is better than that. Tim, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
That's NPR's Tim Mak. The president's closest ally abroad is also accused of abusing his power.
Right. Israel's attorney general announced the indictment of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The charges came after a 3-year investigation. He's accused of illegal dealings with businessmen and media moguls. The charges come after not one but 2 inconclusive elections this year, and his political as well as legal future is right now pretty uncertain.
NPR's Daniel Estrin is in Tel Aviv. Hey there, Daniel.
Hi, Steve.
Now, what, according to the indictment anyway, did the prime minister do?
Well, he's facing charges of fraud, breach of trust. The most serious charge, though, is bribery, and that could carry a jail sentence of 7-10 years. And the bribery allegation is that he and his family got to dictate glowing coverage of themselves on a news website. This happened allegedly hundreds of times. And that in return, he helped the owner of that news site, he's a telecoms executive, by making regulatory decisions that netted a lot of money for the telecoms executive.
Wow.
And Netanyahu is also accused of some other things, of talking to another media mogul about trading positive press for help with his business, and for doing favors for a Hollywood mogul, for the producer of Pretty Woman, and getting a stream of cigars and champagne in return.
Wow. So a variety of charges there. How's the prime minister responding?
Well, he went on TV last night right after the attorney general announced these charges. The attorney general called them grave, and that he's confident that they're likely to result in a conviction. But Netanyahu called it a coup. Here's what he said. He said this is an attempted toppling of the prime minister, and he said the investigation into him was tainted. And he ended his speech with this. We need to finally, once after all, investigate the investigators. That's the same line, of course, that the President Trump said about his administration's investigation into the Russia investigation. So this is Netanyahu's scorched earth approach. He's not leaving office. He is, according to many observers here, delegitimizing the investigation into him and deepening public mistrust in the justice system to shore up his own base.
You said not leaving office. This is a guy who's been through 2 elections this year, hasn't quite gotten enough votes that he can form a government. Can an indicted prime minister stay in office under those circumstances?
That's exactly the question, because there may be third elections coming up, and so there's going to be a question. What happens when Israel's in a transitional government and there are new elections? Can he run for re-election? There's no law forcing him out of office. There's going to be a lot of questions of whether his own political allies will still stay by his side.
Daniel, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Daniel Estrin. The United States is now deporting some asylum seekers to Guatemala.
That's right. Yesterday, the U.S. sent a Honduran migrant to Guatemala after he had arrived in El Paso, Texas. He is the first asylum seeker to be flown to Guatemala under terms of a deal President Trump's administration approved in July. And we should say this marks a major change in U.S. asylum rules.
Which reporter Maria Martin is covering from Guatemala. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
I know immigration law is always complicated, but we can follow it through the story of this one specific person, the very first person to face this new policy. Who is he?
He's a young Honduran named Edwin Ardon, who arrived from El Paso, Texas, where he'd applied for political asylum. He was flown basically alone on this very large plane, which normally brings back over 100 deportees, to Guatemala City on Thursday morning. And Guatemala's interior minister says that more flights with asylum seekers will arrive in the coming week.
So he's a Honduran. He's fleeing this Central American country where there's been a lot of violence. He said he wanted political asylum, and they flew him to Guatemala. What would normally have happened to him when he reached the U.S. under the old rules?
Will he probably be detained in the U.S. or released in the U.S. until his case would be heard? People from Central America could come to the border and apply for asylum there, or they could apply in a safe third country, which until now was only Canada. And if they came to the U.S. border, they usually would be allowed to stay while awaiting an asylum hearing. But under the new accord, Ardon and others will be sent back to Guatemala.
Okay. How are people responding then where you are in Guatemala, the destination of this man and apparently other asylum seekers?
Yes, well, this agreement has been widely unpopular in Guatemala among human rights groups, among civil society and everyday people. They ask, how can Guatemala be considered safe when thousands of Guatemalans are fleeing its high rates of violence and poverty each year, and when the country can't even take care of its own people? The well-known migrant advocate and Catholic priest, Mauro Berceletti, is among the Guatemalans who believe that Guatemala's government was pressured to accept the agreement. It was imposed on us, says Bercelete, placed before us like a sword and a cross for Guatemala to sign under the threat of economic sanctions.
Interesting point you make that Guatemala is supposed to be a country of refuge, but has its own people fleeing their own stories of violence and heading toward the United States. Still, they're getting this first asylum seeker. What's going to happen to him?
Well, that was a big question about him and about additional asylum seekers sent back. Guatemala's Minister of the Interior, Enrique Degenhardt, has said that there are three options for returned people like him, Honduran Salvadorans. One is to be sent back or to be sent to the jungle province of Petén. That's a remote and... Hello?
No, I'm still here. Keep going.
Of Petén, that's a remote and underdeveloped area and rife with drug trafficking. 2, they could be sent back to Honduras or El Salvador. Or 3, they could stay in Guatemala on their own under a Central American Migration Pact that allows free travel in the region. Ardón himself, this young man, has elected to go back to Honduras under a newly announced program of the International Migration Agency. And another question is what will happen to the accord under the new president who takes office in January.
Okay, so started in Honduras, fled all the way to the United States, ended up back in Honduras. Maria Martin, thanks so much.
Thank you.
The civilian head of the Navy is out of a job.
Richard V. Spencer is his name. He was caught between the president above him and the people in uniform below. Now, the original dispute here is clear. The Navy wanted to discipline Eddie Gallagher, who was a Navy SEAL accused of war crimes. President Trump wrote on Twitter that Gallagher should escape that discipline, but the resolution here is confusing. Mark Esper, he's another top civilian, the Secretary of Defense, Richard Spencer's boss. Mark Esper alleges that the Navy Secretary interfered with the military process. He says Spencer tried to work out a compromise with the president, and that was wrong, so Spencer has been dismissed. But having done that, Mark Esper himself decided in favor of the president and said Eddie Gallagher will remain in the service.
Okay, we've got NPR's Pentagon correspondent Tom Bowman with us to help us understand what's going on here because it is confusing. Tom, can you just start off by explaining, based on what Steve just outlined, did the Secretary of the Navy lose his job because he publicly disagreed about how to hold Eddie Gallagher, this disgraced Navy SEAL, accountable? Or did he lose his job because he broke the chain of command in boxing the Secretary of Defense out? Or both?
I think it's probably both, and it's really not clear. Again, Esper said he lost faith in the Navy Secretary Spencer. He said he talked publicly about having a review board to determine whether Gallagher would remain a SEAL, but then told the White House there was a way out. He could retire and keep his SEAL insignia. But what Esper's folks are saying, Spencer's folks are saying, is that Spencer talked to experts, reviewed other similar cases, including the cases of Marines urinating on dead Taliban, and essentially found a compromise out of this. So it's hard to say if it's a chain of command issue or this compromise. What's interesting, though, is Spencer's letter to Trump basically says to the president deserves a Navy secretary who is aligned with his views on the future of our force, which is similar, you may remember, to a letter former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis wrote the president nearly a year ago.
Right, but this one even goes further, I would argue. I mean, Spencer is writing here, the rule of law is what sets us apart from our adversaries. Good order and discipline is what has enabled our victory against foreign tyranny time and again. And goes on, unfortunately, it's become apparent that in this respect, I no longer share the same understanding with the commander-in-chief. I mean, what has been the response to all this, Tom?
Well, that echoes what other officials are saying. There's a great deal of concern in the special operations community about there have been a number of these cases. So what's going on here? Is it after 18 years of war, the standards of being lowered? Are junior officers and non-commissioned officers looking the other way for wrongdoing? So the head of the Special Operations Command, General Rich Clark, even before all of this mess, decided to put together an advisory board looking at those questions. Do you have a problem in the special operations community? And they expect to come up with a report in the next few months.
Where's Eddie Gallagher in all this? Clearly, he's feeling probably pretty good.
Well, yeah. Well, Gallagher always said he wanted to retire with his honors, and here he is speaking on Fox News yesterday.
I don't know how many times I thank the president. He keeps, stepping in and doing the right thing. And I want to let him know that the rest of the SEAL community is not about this right now. They all respect the president, and what the admiral is doing, showing complete insubordination, is not the good example of good order and discipline.
And again, what Esper is saying is it's curious because he's allowing Gallagher to keep his insignia, and that's just kind of odd here.
Right, and there are plenty of other military officials who would argue the opposite, that it was Spencer who was upholding the military's conception of good order and discipline. NPR's Tom Bowman. Thanks, Tom. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, in Hong Kong elections, pro-democracy voters turned out in record numbers to deliver a message to China.
Yeah, pro-democracy candidates defeated longtime occupants of local council seats throughout Hong Kong. This was seen as a symbolic referendum for the anti-government movement, or we should say the anti-central government movement. Now, in a statement today, Hong Kong's leader, who is backed by Beijing, by the national government in China, said the government will respect the results of the election. Carrie Lam said the Hong Kong government will, quote, listen to the opinions of members of the public humbly and seriously reflect.
All right, we've got NPR's Emily Fang on the line from Hong Kong. Emily, you are out in the world. Tell me where you are, first of all.
We're right outside Polytechnic University, where about 60 of some newly elected pro-democratic district councillors are trying to negotiate access to this campus. Since Sunday, dozens of protesters have barricaded themselves inside and refused to come out, and these district councillors say their first act in office is to negotiate their way in and bring these people out.
So just talk about the results here. I mean, this is a huge surprise, is it not?
It wasn't a huge surprise, but it definitely exceeded expectations. Pro-Democrats now have 86% of district council seats. So if you look at the map of Hong Kong right now, it is all pro-Democrat, except for the very fringes of Hong Kong. Voter turnout was the highest it ever has been in any election in Hong Kong history at 71%.
Right.
And so now everyone's looking to 2022, which is when a committee chooses the city's next leader. District councillors don't make policy, but they do have one important responsibility. They make up just 1/10 of that committee that chooses the leader. But there's a lot of excitement. Overhanging that excitement is that a handful of protesters are still trapped on this campus that I'm standing right outside of. And so today, these district councillors outside, I went to a lunchtime protest and I spoke to a 26-year-old financial analyst named Jackson Chang, who said the elections for him were a bittersweet victory.
I was happy at that moment, but the time I think of what we have paid for such votes, we are paying a lot for such results. So we deserve that. So that shouldn't be unexpected. It shouldn't be a surprise.
He's saying that they've paid a lot for such results, huh?
That they paid in terms of the lives of these protesters who are trapped inside this campus now, and that's why hundreds are here trying to rescue them.
So what is the official reaction from Beijing, from China's central government, if anything, at this point?
Well, there's been no official state response, but state media has not been pleased. They've accused the, quote, West for meddling in the elections to throw the results. Carrie Lam, notably, Hong Kong's chief executive, has not come out and made a live statement, but she released a statement saying that she would reflect on the election results. But what the elections show is that the collective power of the Hong Kong people is quite unified, and this is why Hong Kong and Beijing are at an impasse. For Hong Kong, they think democracy works. Yesterday, the elections were incredibly orderly. There were no protests, but the results were surprising. They were open-ended and stunning, and Beijing just can't tolerate that kind of political uncertainty.
All right, NPR's Emily Fang in Hong Kong. Emily, thanks for your reporting. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Michael Bloomberg says he's in. The former mayor of New York is running for the Democratic presidential nomination.
He's a former Republican, also a former independent, also a businessman, media executive, and billionaire. At age 77, Bloomberg has talked of running for president for many years. Now he says he really will run and that he will use his estimated $58 billion personal fortune to finance his run. That means he doesn't qualify for the next debate, which does require voter fundraising as a sign of support. Bloomberg will also skip the early primaries and instead set his sights on Super Tuesday in March, when a large number of delegates will be in play. He explains his run in an ad this way.
Mike Bloomberg for president, jobs creator, leader, problem solver. It's going to take all three to build back a country.
We've got NPR's Mara Liasson with us this morning. So, Mara, tell me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that Michael Bloomberg had already gone down this road and had decided that if Joe Biden was going to run, he wasn't going to do it. So what changed?
I think for Michael Bloomberg, that his theory of the case is that both leading candidates of the centrist and left-wing lanes in the Democratic Party have been disappointing, and they're both unelectable. Elizabeth Warren, too far to the left. Joe Biden having trouble performing and raising money. And that's really the impetus for Bloomberg's entry. I think for many Democrats, he thinks the idea of Joe Biden was appealing, but the reality of Joe Biden has been disappointing. And Biden, of course, is the biggest target for Bloomberg. He's the one that Bloomberg's entry threatens the most. Bloomberg comes in, self-funding, centrist, billionaire Democrat.
Yeah. So his strategy, just skip the early states because it's too late, and he's not going to make the primary debates. Is that a good idea?
Well, we don't know. It's very unorthodox. It's never been done before, but he has many billions of dollars, and that could be a real factor, especially in the primaries after Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, where it's less about visiting every county and meeting a lot of voters one-on-one, more about how much you can afford to spend on TV, and he's already spending more than $30 million in television ads.
Right. So it's all about Super Tuesday for him. So I guess my question is, what does a Michael Bloomberg voter look like? I mean, who would be his base of support?
Well, that is really a good question because he's not registering in the polls right now. He does have a lot of detractors. Of course, other candidates are saying he's just a billionaire trying to buy his way to the nomination. He's also taken some controversial positions in the past, like stop and frisk, New York City Police Department's policy, which a federal judge determined in 2013 violated the constitutional rights of racial minorities, and he is apologizing for that. Here's what he said. Oh. We don't have time to play that.
We don't have that clip, but he did. It was a big reversal for him, wasn't it?
Big reversal. He said, I got something wrong. I didn't understand back then the full impact that the stop and frisk was having on the Black and Latino community.
All right. NPR's Mara Liasson with the latest entry into the already very crowded Democratic nomination process. Mara, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Faced with congressional subpoenas, the White House cannot just say no.
That's the ruling of a federal judge. Congress wants to question the former White House counsel, Don McGahn. President Trump's administration refused. This pitted Congress against the administration, which is to say one branch of government pitted against another. So they asked the third branch, the courts, to referee. And Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson called the foul on the administration. Her order includes the line, "No one is above the law." Her judgment has implications for other current and former White House officials.
NPR Justice correspondent Ryan Lucas is covering this story. Ryan, good morning.
Good morning.
Why did the judge reject the White House claim of executive privilege, a claim to some privacy for the president and people around him?
So Judge Jackson rejected the White House's claim that senior advisors to the president are absolutely immune from testifying before Congress. He says that as a matter of law, presidential aides must appear before lawmakers if compelled to do so. She says advisors to the president can't just blow off a congressional subpoena on the basis of absolute immunity, even if the president demands that they do so. Put simply, she says, and this is a quote from the ruling, quote, "The primary takeaway from the past 250 years of recorded American history is that presidents are not kings."
I'm sorry, that's pretty strong for a court ruling.
It is strong language in this ruling. Obviously, is good news for Congress, but there is a bit of nuance here. The judge says that yes, McGahn must appear, but Judge Jackson does not say that McGahn has to answer every question that the committee asks. In other words, the judge isn't saying that McGahn has to speak about matters covered by executive privilege.
Oh, this is interesting. So there is a doctrine called executive privilege. The courts may well recognize it in certain cases. The thing that the judge rejects is that the idea that the White House can just say no to everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
So what is it exactly that Congress, House Democrats, we should emphasize, they're the people in control of the House here. What do they want to know from Don McGahn?
So remember, McGahn was White House counsel until about a year ago. So he was in Trump's inner circle during most of special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation, and he was a key witness for Mueller. McGahn provided investigators with his own firsthand knowledge about potential acts of obstruction by the president. So lawmakers really, really wanted to hear from McGahn. They subpoenaed him in the spring for testimony. The White House then blocked McGahn from appearing, citing this legal opinion about absolute immunity for top presidential advisors.
Well, could this court ruling in some way affect the impeachment proceedings that focus on Ukraine, even though Don McGahn is not known to be part of that story?
Right. The administration has blocked other senior administration officials from testifying in the Ukraine matter. That includes acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, former Deputy National Security Advisor Charles Kupperman. Those two were both subpoenaed as part of the House impeachment inquiry. Both refused to appear. In theory, yes, this ruling could provide political cover for individuals like those two who want to come forward and testify. But there's no indication at this point that Mulvaney or Kupperman or former National Security Advisor John Bolton, for that matter, really do want to come forward and testify. The House wants Kupperman, for example, to abide by this ruling, has said so in court filings. But Kupperman's lawyer has said that his situation is different because he deals with national security, and therefore he's not going to follow the McGahn ruling.
Okay, so for now what we have is a ruling on Don McGahn. Is it possible the public could hear soon whatever he has to say?
Don't hold your breath, Steve.
Okay.
The Justice Department plans to appeal this. That will send this case to the D.C. Circuit. Any decision there is likely to be appealed as well. The stakes are high here. This is a separation powers question, as we said earlier. And while the Judiciary Committee has said that it wants to hear from McGahn, the House Intelligence Committee is leading the impeachment inquiry. It's going to start drawing up its report. So there is a constricted time frame for all this to happen.
Yet another news story that's compelling on its face and also a kind of civics lesson. Ryan, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
That's NPR's Ryan Lucas. Now, how do the House impeachment hearings play in Moscow?
It's a relevant question. Here's why. President Trump faces scrutiny for his involvement in Ukraine, which is a country at war with Russia. Several impeachment witnesses made references to Russia in their testimony. The most notable was Fiona Hill, a former White House specialist on Eastern Europe.
Right now, Russia's security services and their proxies have geared up to repeat their interference in the 2020 election. We are running out of time to stop them. In the course of this investigation, I would ask that you please not promote politically driven falsehoods that so clearly advance Russian interests.
Among those falsehoods, she said, inflating Ukraine's role in the 2016 election in a way that obscures Russia's interference.
NPR's Lucian Kim is on the line from Moscow. Hey there, Lucian.
Good morning.
First, could you settle a question for us, because there's been some debate here in the U.S. Fiona Hill testified that when President Trump's defenders play up Ukraine's role in the 2016 election, they're promoting a Kremlin narrative. Is that a Kremlin narrative?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just recently, President Vladimir Putin said publicly that he was grateful the U.S. is no longer blaming Russia for election interference and looking instead at what Ukraine did. Basically, anything that deflects from what happened in 2016 is positive for the Kremlin. And even more than that, anything that puts Ukraine in a negative light is even better from the Kremlin's point of view.
Oh, because the Kremlin is leaning on Ukraine and is at war with Ukraine. How did the Kremlin respond more broadly to these impeachment hearings?
Well, actually, the Kremlin has largely declined to make any official comments on the hearings themselves. It seems they're mostly sitting back and watching chaos and division in the United States. Fiona Hill warned about repeating Russian narratives. And what's interesting is you do hear them all the time on Russian state TV. State television refers to the impeachment hearings as a big political show and recently said everybody is too busy attacking President Trump to ask what the Bidens did in Ukraine.
Oh, okay. Actually picking up one of President Trump's narratives there. Well, what do Russian officials say about the upcoming 2020 election, which is also part of the focus of this impeachment inquiry, of course?
Sure. Well, first of all, the Kremlin has always denied it ever interfered in the 2016 election and says, of course, it doesn't plan to interfere in 2020. Recently, it seems, though, that Russian leaders have been trolling the U.S. a bit. President Putin has publicly joked about meddling in 2020, and so has his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Here he is speaking at a conference in Paris earlier this month.
The presidential elections are coming up in 2020, so how is Russia getting ready for that?
We'll resolve the problem, don't worry.
So as you can hear, not a lot of people thought the joke was that funny.
The U.S. did strike back at Russia in various ways for interfering in 2016. Does Moscow seem at all deterred?
Exactly. The U.S. struck back with sanctions, but I wouldn't say Moscow is deterred. There's actually been a huge development here in Europe. During the impeachment hearings, French President Emmanuel Macron has been reaching out to Russia. He will be hosting a summit between Presidents Volodymyr Zelensky and Putin in a couple of weeks. And now Ukraine is going into that meeting without the American support it had been expecting.
No, a summit between the presidents of Ukraine and Russia. Lucian, thanks so much.
Thank you.
NPR's Lucian Kim. The latest of many countries facing public protests is Colombia, and its leaders say that today they will meet the people who've been marching since last week.
That's the sound of demonstrators who are targeting the right-wing government of President Ivan Duque. Demonstrations have been mostly peaceful, but not entirely. Last night, protests in the capital, Bogota, claimed the life of a student. A tear gas canister struck the 18-year-old. Reporter John Otis joins us from Bogota. Hey there, John.
Hey, good to be here, Steve.
I thought Colombia was the country that was prosperous and getting more peaceful and moving in the right direction, even as others go in the wrong direction. Why are people protesting?
Well, you're right. Colombia is doing better than a lot of other countries, at least economically. But there is high unemployment here, which is running at about 10%. Protesters are also concerned about labor reforms that would cut pensions and the minimum wage for young workers. There's been rising violence in the countryside where hundreds of human rights workers have been killed. And people also think that President Duque just hasn't done very much to implement a 2016 peace treaty that ended a long guerrilla war here. A lot of these protesters, rather than being opposition politicians or labor leaders or longtime activists, they're young people, they're first-time protesters who think President Duque has just lost touch with the country. I spoke with one of them, Alejandro Giraldo. He's a 28-year-old lawyer, and this is what he said.
There is a change right now, and all the young people is gathering around some places, and they are connecting with each other to take this country to a better level or to a better quality of life.
You know, John, when I'm listening to that recording, I'm listening to the words, but also the backdrop, the musical instruments or percussion instruments going on there. What's it like when you're out there in the streets with people?
Yeah, well, what you're hearing, that's called a cacerolazo. That's a sort of a Latin American tradition of banging pots and pans during protests. They've also been singing the national anthem, and people are really enthusiastic. There's sort of a celebratory mood in some ways. But at the same time, there have been some outbreaks of looting and vandalism, and that's led to a police crackdown. And as you mentioned, this 18-year-old student named Dylan Cruz, he was peacefully protesting Saturday when he was hit in the face with a tear gas canister. He died last night. And this is sort of the disproportionate use of force that can actually lead to bigger and longer protests.
Well, now the government is getting involved, or at least saying it's willing to meet with the protesters. What can the government offer the people who are in the streets?
Well, that's part of the problem, the whole government's response to this thing. They've been kind of late. They sort of dismissed the protests at first. They suggested, some government officials suggested that it was part of a left-wing conspiracy. But now President Ivan Duque is calling for the protesters to meet with him. They're going to start direct meetings for what he calls a national conversation. And those meetings are scheduled to start today. So we're going to see some dialogue between the two sides at last after 6 days of protests.
Okay, we'll find out what they do have to talk about. John, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's reporter John Otis in Bogota, Colombia.
The order came from the President of the United States. Do not distribute the nearly $400 million in military aid to Ukraine. But he didn't give a reason, at least not to staff at the Office of Management and Budget.
That's all according to a new transcript of closed-door testimony. Mark Sandy gave it. He's a career official at the OMB. That office works as a branch of the White House, helping the president run the government. Mr. Sandy was involved when the president held up military aid to Ukraine. He knew the payment had been approved by Congress and signed into law by the president himself.
So NPR congressional reporter Claudia Grisales is with us to kind of walk through what we've learned from this testimony and another. Claudia, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. So let's talk this through. Mark Sandy was concerned about the holdup of the Ukraine aid. Tell us more.
Yes, so Sandy said he immediately raised concerns about holding up this aid, concerns that it could violate the law. He said he learned about the hold on July 18 and was unclear how long it would stay in place and why. He reported that worry to a top OMB official, Mike Duffy, the very next day. We should note that according to a new summary we obtained from the House Budget Committee, OMB issued its first official hold to the aid in writing the evening of July 25th, hours after that now famous call between President Trump and the Ukrainian leader. And Sandy said he knew they were on this clock to release the aid to Ukraine. He said they had to release it by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. If not, they could violate something called the Impoundment Control Act, which requires this sort of assistance to be obligated before it expires or the money goes back to the Treasury Department. And this was his central argument, that if this money was held up past the deadline, they could be breaking the law.
And worth just underscoring that that timeline, that July 25th, the first effort to hold the aid up, and this happened just hours after President Trump made that infamous phone call with Ukraine's leader. So was Mark Sandy alone? Did others share his concerns?
Actually, yes, Sandy testified that he wasn't alone. He said 2 other OMB officials resigned, at least in part because of the hold and the confusion and concerns surrounding it. One person who left in September had expressed frustrations with requests to hold up this kind of assistance. He said the other individual worked in OMB's legal section and they left in part because of this hold on the aid. He said at least one of these individuals expressed concern for not understanding the reason for the hold.
So after Sandy testified, Republicans gave the message that they've been giving. This whole thing is a charade. I want to play some tape from Congressman Lee Zeldin.
This was one of the worst, most unsuccessful fishing expeditions that I have witnessed. And today was a sobering reminder of just how ridiculous this impeachment charade is.
But Mark Sandy's account lines up with what we've heard from other officials, right?
Yes, it syncs up with what other officials who have testified have said about being in the dark for some time as to why the security aid was being held up. The dates also align with what we've heard from others. That said, not many White House officials have testified because they've been directed not to participate in this impeachment probe. He and others reported their concerns to the top OMB official we mentioned earlier, Mike Duffy. He was called before the House Intelligence Committee, but was directed by the president not to appear.
So real quick, we need to address another bit of testimony from Philip Rieker. What's the top line out of that?
Well, he mentioned a lot of these key characters we've heard, former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and the campaign against her, as well as the ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff, says he was the person who helped direct this order to hold up the aid. So he tied a lot of these key figures together in the saga.
That was from Philip Rieker, testimony from Philip Rieker, a senior State Department official. Claudia Grisales, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Federal prosecutors in New York have launched an investigation of at least 6 pharmaceutical companies.
Here's our question. Did these drug makers create a massive oversupply of opioids in some communities? If they did, prosecutors may charge them under a criminal statute that is commonly used to target drug dealers. Since 1999, the opioid epidemic has killed more than 400,000 people in the United States.
Reporter Brian Mann with North Country Public Radio joins us now. He covers opioid litigation for NPR. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, Rachel.
So which pharmaceutical companies are we talking about, and what are federal prosecutors alleging here?
Yeah, so some of the biggest players in the drug industry are drawing new scrutiny here. Manufacturers like Teva and Johnson & Johnson, distributors McKesson and AmerisourceBergen. What we know is that they've been getting subpoenas for documents relating to prescription opioids, the subpoenas coming from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. We know this because the companies have been disclosing these demands in public filings to investors. So far, federal prosecutors themselves keeping a very tight lid on what charges, if any, they might bring. They declined to confirm or deny to NPR that a full-blown criminal probe is even underway.
So the law that's possibly being applied here, the Federal Controlled Substances Act, this was designed to nail drug dealers. Explain how this might be used to go after allegations of corporate crime.
So the Controlled Substances Act required these companies to create elaborate programs designed to track orders that came in for prescription opioids, to track suspicious orders. And in theory, Rachel, that should have stopped most of the diversion of these highly addictive medications, drugs that went to the black market. Companies say they complied, they played by the rules, but government data released over the last year shows a flood of pills kept going to pharmacies and doctors behaving really suspiciously. A lot of those pills wound up on the street. So the big question is why that happened. Companies clearly made a lot of profits boosting these opioid sales. Whether prosecutors think they can prove companies violated the law deliberately and knowingly in criminal ways, we just haven't seen them sort of show their math there yet.
Right. Is there any precedent for this?
Yeah, there are. We've seen convictions back in May. 5 executives with a drug company called Insys Therapeutics found guilty on a bunch of federal criminal charges relating to the sale of fentanyl. Prosecutors hailed that as a first-of-its-kind conviction, compared these guys to street drug dealers. But just yesterday, a judge tossed out the portion of that conviction tied to the Controlled Substances Act. The judge ruled it wasn't completely clear these executives meant for their drugs to be used for non-medical purposes. So that shows how hard it can be to make these corporate prosecutions stick.
Right. Are the drug companies themselves saying anything about this investigation?
They have been reacting. Earlier this year, one major drug distributor, Rochester Drug Cooperative, paid to settle criminal charges, admitted what they called mistakes. Most companies, though, deny wrongdoing. They said they are complying with these new subpoenas, but they also say opioids were highly regulated. The federal government knew all along how many pills were being made and where they were being shipped.
All right, Brian Mann with North Country Public Radio. He talked with us on Skype. Brian, thanks for your reporting. As always, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.
You know the drill. You swipe, you click, you buy. For millions of Americans this Black Friday, one-click shopping via Amazon will be a convenience too hard to pass up.
But what price do Amazon warehouse workers pay to ensure same-day delivery?
What kinds of injuries have you seen?
I've seen knee injuries. I've seen shoulder injuries. I've seen people pull things out and cut themselves.
Why do you think so many people are getting hurt?
Because they have to meet their quota.
That's a little bit from the program Reveal, which comes from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Their investigation, which was also published in The Atlantic, found alarming injury rates at Amazon warehouses.
Will Evans is a reporter with Reveal, and he joins us now on Skype. Will, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, alarming rates, alarming injury rates. Can you be more specific? What did you find?
Yeah, so we got the official injury records for 23 Amazon fulfillment centers around the country. And overall, we found that the rate of serious injuries was more than double the industry average for warehousing. And some of the warehouses we found had much higher rates, as high as 26 injuries per 100 workers. So that's basically a quarter of the workers. These are off the charts injury rates, and they're from Amazon's own records.
Wow. So, I mean, why? Can you give us a sense of what the work is like? These people, these Amazon employees who are working in these warehouses, what kind of physical labor is involved?
Yeah, so you're basically standing at your station and either grabbing customers' orders from these tall racks or putting items away, filling the racks, and you're squatting down for the heavy items and popping back up for the next thing. And you have to do hundreds of these an hour for up to 12-hour shifts. and you'll get written up or fired if you don't keep up. So one worker I talked to, she had to scan a new item every 11 seconds. And, within 2 months, it basically destroyed her back. She's now out of work and in pretty constant pain.
Wow. So what about the robots, Will? I mean, I thought Amazon was all about automation, and this was part of, their grand vision that they were going to automate so much of this work, and that was going to put less pressure on employees.
Right. Workers, no longer have to walk miles at their job, but, the robots bring the packages to them. That was supposed to be easier. But the problem is the robots are faster, so the humans have to be faster. They're held to much higher aggressive production quotas, and so their bodies are basically breaking down. We found that many of the warehouses with the highest injury rates actually have the robots.
Wow. So what's Amazon saying about this?
So they wouldn't do an interview with us, but the company said its injury rates are high because it's really diligent about recording the injuries, and it's careful not to send workers back to their jobs before they're ready. The problem is, Amazon safety managers, former safety managers I talked to said Amazon knows it has a problem. It just won't address the underlying issue, which is how hard and fast they're pushing these workers.
All right, Will Evans with Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, talking about his reporting about Amazon and the injury rates there among warehouse employees. Will, it's great reporting. Thank you so much for bringing it our way. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
What was President Trump's personal lawyer really seeking from Ukraine?
We know this much. Rudy Giuliani was looking for political dirt on Democrats. Giuliani talked about that long before President Trump's own request to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden became known. He was working with a Ukrainian prosecutor. Now, the Washington Post and other outlets report Giuliani was trying to get paid by Ukraine. The Post says he was in talks to go on the prosecutor's payroll for at least $200,000.
Matt Zapotowski is one of the reporters on that story, and he joins us via Skype. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And happy Thanksgiving to you. Thanks for spending a little bit of it with us. Why would the president's friend and lawyer be asking for six-figure payments from a foreign government?
Boy, I just think he wanted to work for these guys. It's a really complicated kind of mess over there. So at the same time that Rudy Giuliani is pressing this Ukrainian prosecutor, a guy named Yuri Lutsenko, to help him investigate the Bidens, he's trying to cut kind of a side deal where Yuri Lutsenko will pay him $200,000 or $300,000 as a retainer fee to help Yuri Lutsenko with this kind of asset recovery mission. Yuri Lutsenko believed that Ukrainian assets had been stolen and the U.S. could help him get them back, and he thought Rudy would be a good conduit to the Justice Department. So at the same time Rudy is pressing this guy to help with his investigation, he's contemplating signing on board with Mr. Lutsenko to help Mr. Lutsenko.
Wow, and why not hire someone who is close to the president and is representing the president? I guess if you're a Ukrainian, you might ask that question. But what evidence shows that Giuliani tried this?
Well, draft contracts that have been described to us as the evidence that shows this. Some of the contracts contemplate Mr. Giuliani working for Mr. Lutsenko directly. Some contemplate him working for the Ukrainian Ministry of Justice. Others contemplate involving these two other Washington lawyers that might be familiar, particularly to viewers of Fox News, a woman named Vicky Tunting and a guy named Joe DeGenova, who are also strong allies of the president. But the evidence is the contracts.
Now, Rudy Giuliani has tweeted about this, and he says, quote, "I did not pursue a business opportunity in Ukraine as they misrepresented." He says he was paid zero. First, I would note misrepresented implies there's something there. He just doesn't like how you characterized it.
Yeah, I think he's really zeroing in on the fact that these deals are never sort of consummated. Even though contracts are traded back and forth, they're ultimately never executed. And Rudy Giuliani says he was never paid. Of course, we and the other people who reported on this had reported that these deals were never consummated. But that's what Rudy seems to be driving at. Look, because this deal never ultimately got done, it's sort of not fair, I guess, to report on it.
Okay, got to note, this is the kind of thing that Giuliani was trying to pin on Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, somebody getting paid for being close to the government. Here's Giuliani, someone close to the current government, talking about getting paid. Now, as all of this is breaking, or maybe a little before, really, President Trump was giving an interview to Bill O'Reilly, the former Fox News host. And it's interesting here, Matt, because Trump barely seemed to know who Giuliani was anymore. Let's listen.
What was Rudy Giuliani doing in Ukraine on your behalf?
Well, you have to ask that to Rudy, but Rudy, I don't even know. I know he was going to go to Ukraine, and I think he canceled the trip. But, Rudy has other clients other than me.
What do you make of that, Matt?
It's just so curious that the president would sort of imply that he didn't know exactly what Rudy was up to. Everyone, I'm sure, remembers on the president's phone call with his Ukrainian part, he said, talk to Rudy. He clearly knew what Rudy was up to, and it's curious to see him try to distance himself now.
And not only in that phone call, but according to sworn testimony, he did that to person after person after person. Matt Zapotowski of the Washington Post, thanks for your reporting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Also in that talk with Bill O'Reilly, President Trump made the kind of statement that often grabs headlines, a statement about something he says he may do.
All right, the president said he will designate drug cartels as terror groups. This is a clip from his conversation with Bill O'Reilly.
I've actually offered him to let us go in and clean it out, and he so far has rejected the offer. But at some point, something has to be done.
The president very often makes predictions, and then he doesn't follow through on them. So we just have to be frank and tell you that as of now, we have no reliable information as to whether he will or will not do this. But the very idea has led Mexican officials to ask if U.S. military action is next.
Journalist James Frederick is in Mexico City. Good morning.
Good morning.
And thanks to you for working on the holiday, the American holiday, I should say. How seriously is the Mexican government taking this possibility?
Well, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador told Mexicans they didn't need to be worried, but he summed up his position on it pretty concisely at a press conference yesterday.
Cooperación, sí. Intervencionismo, no.
So there, President López Obrador is saying yes to cooperating with the U.S. on drug war issues, but no to intervention. So what he's getting at here is this concern in Mexico that Trump is really eager for the U.S. military to go after cartels, and that this terrorist designation is just a way to move towards that. The López Obrador government says the militarized war on drugs of his predecessors didn't work, and they want to ramp it down. So Trump's attitude on this really puts them in conflict, which is bad if they're trying to cooperate to fight cartels.
How would a terror designation change the fight against cartels in a practical sense?
Well, the first question to answer, and we still don't know about this, is whether the U.S. is interested in being involved militarily, because that would change a lot more things. But this terrorist designation, in practice, does a few things. First of all, it gives the U.S. the ability to impose sanctions on people involved with those groups. So anyone helping them financially or supporting them in any way could face U.S. punishment. But that's not totally new, because the U.S. Treasury Department already sanctions many people in Mexico affiliated with cartels. The other thing it would do is it could put U.S. counterterrorism resources into the fight against cartels. So, more surveillance, more intelligence to fight cartels. But, that also brings up a question of moving away counterterrorism resources that are being used elsewhere in the world. And also the Drug Enforcement Administration is pretty active in Mexico fighting cartels. So there's a question of how much counterterrorism would move the needle here.
You're already hinting at some of the potential downsides. What are some others?
Well, there's lots of unintended consequences. There's so many to go through. I think the first one to think about is how you identify someone as a member or collaborator of a cartel. So in recent years here in Mexico, there's been a huge splintering of drug cartels. There are now dozens of them in Mexico. Affiliation with them isn't very clear. It's constantly shifting. And the other issue is, as I said, with the sanctions, lots of people are in a difficult position in Mexico and are forced to pay extortion to cartels. Does that mean they're now collaborating with a terrorist organization?
Wow. James, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll continue following that story of something the president said he may do, although, again, it's not clear yet if he will. Reporter James Frederick. New rules by the Trump administration may make it harder for the public to find out what happened at a Texas chemical plant.
People heard the explosion miles away. Jefferson County Judge Jeff Brannick feared his home was under attack.
Grabbed my pistol and ran to the front door. I saw that the front and back door were splintered and the wood had flown everywhere. So it was obvious that then I could see the flames from the backyard.
That's Judge Brannick speaking with 12 News Now. He later issued a mandatory evacuation within a 4-mile radius of the chemical plant in Port Neches, east of Houston. The first blast injured at least 3 workers and some residents. Hours later, people felt a second explosion.
Now, what's all that have to do with the new U.S. rules for investigating accidents? These are rules that rolled back proposals from the Obama administration. Matt Dempsey is following this story. He is a data editor with the Houston Chronicle. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thanks for having me.
What are the rules that changed, or changed back, I guess we should say?
Yeah, as my reporting partner Perla Treviso and I reported last week, said the new rules, companies will not have to do third-party audits or root cause analysis after an incident. They will also not have to provide the public access to information about what type of chemicals are stored in those facilities. The Environmental Protection Agency described those rules as unnecessary. It said it would save companies money and prevent what they called the potential security risk of disclosing more about a plant's location and its chemical inventories.
But I want to be really clear about this. When you say they don't have to do a third-party audit, that means they don't have to have as many independent outside authorities looking into a disaster like this.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Is there anybody independent who is going to get in there and look at Texas regulators, federal regulators, anybody else?
Well, the U.S. Chemical Safety Board is the main agency that does root cause analyses as third parties. They come in and they look at things, but they don't look at every single incident, only some. They're going to be deploying to the one that just happened this week, but that's not always the case. And it makes it harder, too, because the Obama-era regulations that we just talked about that got rolled back, well, they were never fully implemented, and they were already pretty industry-friendly on top of that. So there wasn't a lot of teeth in the regulations that got rolled back in, and we don't have a lot of third-party analysis outside of the Chem Safety Board if they come in.
Bottom line, I'm thinking of aircraft accidents in the United States. There are independent investigations. A lot of information comes out. The airline industry gets safer and safer. Is it just way short of that in the chemical industry?
Yes, that's true. It's way short of that. And the problem, too, with that is airplane crashes are a good example. We've seen the worst of aircraft incidents. We haven't seen the worst of what a chemical industry incident could be. Even in the ones that we've seen, it could be far, far worse. And we've just been fortunate that it hasn't occurred that way.
Mr. Dempsey, thanks so much, and happy Thanksgiving to you.
Thanks.
Matt Dempsey is a data editor with the Houston Chronicle.
The United States is once again talking with the Taliban about a pathway to peace.
President Trump said so anyway during a Thanksgiving visit to Afghanistan. Traveling with no advance notice for security reasons, the president arrived at Bagram Airfield. That's a big U.S. base outside Kabul. The president passed out Thanksgiving meals to U.S. troops, met Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani, and asserted this about the Taliban.
They want to make a deal, so we'll see what happens. If they make it, fine. If they don't make it, that's fine. We're going to be able to do everything we're doing and actually more. And at the same time, we're bringing down the number of troops substantially.
The president's talk of negotiating with the Taliban comes a few months after an effort to make a deal fell apart.
For more, we've got NPR's Pentagon correspondent Tom Bowman is following all of this and joins us now. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Rachel.
So this was President Trump's first trip to Afghanistan, we should say. Why this moment?
Well, first of all, it was Thanksgiving, and presidents and other senior government officials have often visited troops overseas during the holidays. And also the president's never been to Afghanistan before, as you said. He's traveled to Iraq. So I'm sure advisors have been pushing for this because Afghanistan, unlike Iraq, is an ongoing war. And of course, right now, the longest war in American history.
Right. So, it would be opportune to have this trip coincide with the resumption of peace talks, but do we know if that's actually happening?
What we know is that there have been informal talks in Doha, Qatar with the Taliban. And now, as the president said and others have said, they expect to have formal talks begin at some point in Doha, Qatar.
So is that what's new? He's saying we're going to start them again?
It appears to be what's new. The American envoy for the peace talks, Zalmay Khalilzad, has been shuttling around. He's in Pakistan talking with officials there. So it looks like talks will begin once again.
But how do we know this is, again, the peace talks, as Steve noted a few months ago, fell apart in dramatic fashion. I mean, there were representatives from the Taliban who were already on their way to the United States to go to Camp David for this big event. And then the president said, we're stopping.
Right. The president planned to have the Taliban negotiators again at Camp David to sign a peace deal. That surprised many analysts, but he then abruptly canceled the meeting at Camp David because what he said were continued Taliban attacks, including one that killed an American soldier. So again, this is all, it's all uncertain, really. Again, preliminary talks, will there be formal talks? I guess as a president would say, we'll wait and see.
Right. Do we have any indication as to whether or not the Taliban and the central government in Afghanistan, led by the democratically elected Ashraf Ghani, I mean, is there any common ground there? Because that's really the key, right?
Well, the only common ground really is everybody wants to see a reduction in violence in Afghanistan. Civilian casualties have risen dramatically over the past year. The Americans are hitting the Taliban hard, hoping to bring them to the table, and the Taliban are responding in kind. So, they are far apart. The Taliban want all American troops out of Afghanistan, and what the Americans want is the Taliban to renounce violence, to reduce attacks, maybe have a ceasefire, and basically also turn their back on support for any terrorist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, which is what started the war in the first place.
All right, NPR's Pentagon correspondent Tom Bowman. Thanks, Tom. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Rachel.
Some people in Hong Kong are singing a song Americans know well. This after President Trump signed 2 bills supporting the pro-democracy movement this week.
Yeah, people in Hong Kong staged a so-called Thanksgiving rally downtown to thank the United States. Beijing reacted rather differently to the U.S. legislation by summoning the U.S. ambassador and demanding a halt to what Chinese mainland authorities see as U.S. interference in domestic affairs.
We've got NPR's Emily Feng on the line from Beijing this morning. Hi, Emily.
Hello.
So first, let's just explain what these 2 bills, now laws, what do they do?
Right. One of them mandates an annual review of Hong Kong's autonomy from China, and it stakes the city's trade status with the U.S. on it. And the reason why that's a big deterrence is because Hong Kong's special trading status with the U.S. allows the city, and thus China, preferential access to U.S. markets, U.S. companies, just as if Hong Kong were a separate country while still technically being part of China. And the second bill bars the sale of munitions to Hong Kong police, things like tear gas and rubber bullets, which have been used in larger and larger quantities against protesters. Here in Beijing, though, Chinese officials are really unhappy, to say the least. They see the 2 bills as interference in China's domestic politics, and they have used strong language to back that up. They've called the bills, quote, hegemonic, and the intentions behind them, quote, malicious.
I mean, what will be the practical effect of this legislation? I mean, is this expected to significantly help protesters?
It really depends on who you ask. Virtually all pro-democracy advocates support the bill signed this week because they see it as an efficient deterrence against China. I talked to Andy Chan. He's one of Hong Kong's more radical independence activists, but he summarizes the reason for their support well.
China needs Hong Kong more than Hong Kong needs China. At the beginning, it seems nothing, but it will create a chain reaction, and it just implode the economic crisis in China.
So they're making a really risky bluff here. They're betting that China will not interfere in Hong Kong because it needs Hong Kong economically. But a lot of critics point out Hong Kong's economy is also not doing well. It's actually officially in a recession, largely due to the ongoing protests. And losing that trade status it has with the U.S. would completely tank its economy. Even just threatening to take away the trade status already makes Hong Kong a riskier place to invest. And if Hong Kong doesn't have that status, it doesn't make it special anymore compared to a Chinese city. So if you were a foreign business, you may as well just set up shop in mainland China rather than Hong Kong.
I mean, speaking of bluffs, how serious are Beijing's threats to retaliate against the U.S. for passing these laws?
They've made really vague threats saying they'll, quote, take countermeasures against the U.S. for the bills, but they've kept those threats intentionally vague, and that's a strategy they use, to use ambiguity as a method of intimidation. I think that they're just waiting to see what the U.S. does, and they'll calibrate their response to that.
And what about the trade talks? I mean, how does this play into it, if at all?
The U.S. and China have signaled that they are not linking trade talks with human rights in Hong Kong, but something to look out for is one of the bills Trump signed does say the president can sanction Chinese officials who violate human rights in Hong Kong. That would be a huge step, and it's perhaps one that the president isn't willing to take.
All right, NPR's Beijing correspondent Emily Fang for us this morning. Emily, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
The University of Farmington in Michigan billed itself as an innovative learning hub for science and technology students. It even had a scholarly Latin motto, Scientia et Labor, knowledge and work. There was just one problem. The school was fake.
A fake university created by the Department of Homeland Security, all to lure immigrant students who were in the U.S. on student visas and looking for ways to stay. This sting took place in January. The Detroit Free Press has the details, reporting that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested recruiters and dozens of students. Now, according to ICE, 250 students have been arrested on immigration violations in connection with the operation, and many students have already been deported.
Neeraj Wariku has been covering this story for the Detroit Free Press and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is very confusing. Can you please explain how this worked? The U.S. government was luring in potential students and then arresting them for visa violations?
Correct. In 2015, federal agents with the Department of Homeland Security created this fictitious university in a Detroit suburb called Farmington Hills, and the university's name was University of Farmington. They had websites, they had a Facebook page, all saying that this is a legitimate university. They even said it on the government's website that this is approved by the U.S. government, and they had an accreditation agency also say that it's an okay university.
Who enrolled?
Most of the students were from India, specifically from Telugu-speaking regions. Word kind of spread in that community once a few enrolled that it was a good place to be, or a place where you could get CPT training. CPT stands for curricular practical training that some foreign students do.
But I guess what I don't understand, these were not illegal immigrants until the United States government made them so, right?
Correct. They arrived legally on student visas, and they were in status up until the time they were arrested. And then the U.S. government said, of course, well, this university is not legitimate because it's our university. Therefore, you're out of status and you're no longer here illegally.
So, but still, is the U.S. government's position that these students should have known better? That it was a fake university, but they didn't cover up the fakeness of it very well, and that there were these tells the students should have been able to anticipate?
Yeah, federal prosecutors have argued in court that the students should have known because they were not on-site classes. But in some cases, in other universities, they have online classes. And in other cases, the students did inquire to say, hey, when are you going to have the on-site classes? And the university kept saying, oh, well, it's coming, or they gave various excuses for it. And even some did transfer out. But even those who transferred out from the university were still arrested and are facing legal problems. So even those who recognize there might be an issue are still now in trouble.
I mean, we only have a couple seconds left. Where did their tuition money go, and what happens to these students?
Right. So millions of dollars may have been spent on tuition, and it went to the Department of Homeland Security. Now 80% of the 250 students have been deported or left through voluntary departure. And about 10% are fighting it in the court system.
In the courts. Okay, we have to leave it there. Neeraj Wariku of the Detroit Free Press, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.